In Module 6, we talk about and discuss with you maintaining and monitoring server environments in Windows Server 2016. This is interesting because this is the last portion of managing Windows Server 2016 because now you have all these services are running, whether it's in Hyper-V, whether it's in a physical server or virtual server, you have to know how to maintain the services. You have to know how to monitor it and keep things up and running at all times. So this portion really is, again, another 25 to 30% of the exam that then tests you on knowing when and what to do if there's an issue and how to ensure that you're monitoring on a daily basis so that if there's an alert, you know exactly how to address it. For example, if you have a Hyper-V node that goes down or a VM that goes down, what do you do? Where do you look at? What logs do you look at? And how do you find that information fairly quickly? So we've done our best to list that out here. We start off with maintaining server installations. So things like updating
Updating
Windows Server
security
update
updates, yeah.
services are very important. We've mentioned just managing those backup strategies. What are your backup strategies to make sure that you know exactly, how to ensure that your host, your guest, your Active Directory, your file servers, your web servers all remain up at any point in time. This is a big challenge for industry for infrastructures. Companies are looking for solutions that encompass many of this, and we've built this all into Windows Server 2016. So as an IT pro, an IT administrator, as you learn these contents, it makes you much more valuable in the field when you're asked to be part of, solving these solutions for large
Yep.
companies.
Now, when we talk about updating, we are talking about something that may not be on the exam is that, and if you manage your Windows 10 machines, you know this already, but Patch Tuesdays are security updates. And instead of being 25 or 10 or 15 updates, and you can pick and choose which ones you're going to install, it's one update now. So it's always one update that comes down and gets deployed to the server. And the benefit of that is when Microsoft builds these updates and tests these updates, it always tests it on a fully updated server. Therefore, we know that those updates are going to work on your server, which is also fully updated. The other thing to note is, and I've mentioned this in the past, and I'll mention it again, things are moving fast in Redmond, and the same thing with Microsoft Learning, and Microsoft Learning is doing its best to catch up. As of today, as we're filming this, Nano Server is the only version of Server 2016 that can be a current branch for business, or a long-term servicing branch. And what that means is every 6 months or so, new features may be introduced to Nano Server, whereas the rest of the server infrastructure, it's long-term servicing branch. They're not getting updates feature updates every 6 months like Windows 10 does.
And that's important to
Yep.
know, right? Because then you have to know exactly why would I install Nano Server versus another platform,
Yep.
and whether or not I need to, take advantage of those features that come with the platform
And
itself.
and for this exam, what you need to do is make sure that before taking this exam, you check with the Microsoft Learning page to see when was this exam updated. Check with TechNet to see if that's still the case, that only Nano Server does CB current branch and current branch for business versions, because the rest of Server 2016, it may follow suit. I don't work for the product group, so I can't tell you if it will, but it might.
Okay, so a few terms to be aware of when we talk about Windows Server update services. So we mentioned bandwidth utilization. We also mentioned update approvals. How do I make sure that those approvals are being updated accordingly based on what's needed? And that if I'm pulling down a set of Windows updates, that I can actually manage those updates when they pull down to the server or the VM in a much more convenient fashion. And then compliance, making sure those systems all remain up
Yep.
to date in terms of patching. So Windows Update allows you to configure and provides, really the configuration provides like no means for administrators to confirm that the client has successfully installed all the required updates, except to examine the update history on each computer individually. So the WSOS architecture is really designed to
The WSUS pushes out updates, and then
exactly.
it can report on which machines grabbed that update, but it's not a compliance like SCCM Configuration Manager might be, or any number of other compliance tools. So it's not actually scanning. WSUS isn't scanning each server to say what do you need. The servers are scanning and scanning WSUS. This is what I need. So WSUS is pushing out those updates, but not actually doing any scanning and reporting on compliance.
Yes. So again, think about what you need for WSUS. It's a part of this platform. We've shown a few scenarios where you basically do an assessment phase, an identity phase, or identify phase where you're actually looking for what patches need to be updated, an evaluation and a plan phase where you're actually deciding what you want to patch and then deploy. So this is a continuous
Yep.
cycle with WSUS, and we'll see that as you're displaying, managing WSUS as a solution. WSUS hasn't gone away with Windows Server 2016. It's
Nope,
still
not
there.
at all.
And we've also provided a number of commandlets, PowerShell commandlets, that tell you exactly how you can run specific commands to update WSUS, to clean up the server, to provide it with some level of dynamic categories, or even server synchronization, all within the same platform. Patch management. So, what are WSUS groups?
So yeah, WSUS groups. There are very few companies. I couldn't name a single one, and I've been through Microsoft Consulting Services and consultant before then for many years. I can't name a single company that pushes patches to all of their servers at the same time, right? Because why would you do that? They'll all update at the same time. If something breaks, they'll all break at the same time, and then they'll all reboot at the same time. And you just don't do that. So WSUS groups are just what it sounds like. It's groupings of computers. You're pushing patches in rolled out phases. Whether those phases are every hour, every day, every week, you're rolling out patches to groupings of computers as they're approved and scheduled for installation on those servers.
So, we also have the integration of WSUS with System Center Service Branch, which allows us to basically do the same sort of patching process and monitoring, and ensure that you're pushing it out based on updates in SCCM. So you can run WSUS as a standalone solution,
Yep.
or you can integrate it with the System Center Configuration Manager because it picks up that role and allows you to control that. But know when that patch management cycle is, and know that it's important to remember that for this exam, and understand how it can integrate with different solutions like Windows Defender and, for example, definition updates.
Yep. Yeah, Windows Defender definition updates, right?
Yes. So Windows Server Backup, another tool. So WB Admin is another tool they can use to back up the system. You can perform full server backups. Again, all built into Windows Server 2016. Imagine having to buy a separate product to do it. But Windows Server Backup is a simple way to make sure that you're backing up your Hyper-V host. You can even back up Active Directory, but you cannot restore from a backup that's older than 100 days old.
180 days. So that's actually important too. When you come up with your backup strategy, and most of us are backing up a full backup once a week, and then differential backups after that, for the rest of the week. But if you decide, I'm a smaller company, I have Active Directory, I don't have a lot of space for my backups, I don't have enough site storage for my backups, I'm just going to back up once every 3 months. Once every 3 months is fine, but not once every 6 months with Active Directory, because when you back up the sysvol for Active Directory domain controllers, you can't restore it if that's more than 6 months old.
Exactly. So remember terms like WB admin, start system recovery, which will then allow you to select a specific system recovery to put the data back. You can also back up file servers, web servers. They're all part of the components that you can use WB admin for. I like it because I think it's a very simple tool. It's easy to use and it can
Yep,
get the job done.
absolutely. Agreed.
Also, we switch over to monitoring server installations. Now, monitoring is around, looking at the performance monitors, the counters, the CPUs, the memory, the disk, the networking counters for storage and compute. All of these are things that you need to be aware about, and also just configuring alerts because you want to be notified when your servers are running out of space. Now, we can also use System Center Virtual Machine Manager. We can use Operations Manager for this, but let's assume that some of these solutions are in place. Windows Server 2016 gives you the ability to configure these settings so you can monitor workloads using specific resource monitors and alert yourself
Yep.
when those issues show up.
We have a lot of those screen grabs. I'm going to show you on my screen. I have my Server 2016 machine running. And I'm going to show you a couple different ones. So first I can go into my Server Manager, of course, where I start everything from, and go to my Performance Monitor. And you can see that I can add different counters to Performance Monitor for whether I want to monitor my memory or processor, RAM, or all the stuff that I want, my network speed and throughput. I'm just going to go ahead and cancel that. So I can also do data collector sets, where a user-defined data collector set. What data am I going to collect, and from where I want to collect these performance counters. I want to go ahead and start that. I can say which ones I'm counting. I can add new ones. So data collector sets allow me to decide what will be collected as part of my monitoring. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. I'm going to show you my Task Manager because it's just Task Manager, but still, when we open up Task Manager, I'm going to minimize that behind it. It's just a small little box. It shows me what's running. I have an MMC console running, which is my Hyper-V, and I have Server Manager running. But when I click More Details, I have a bigger view of the processes, the performance, the users that are currently logged in, details about each one that's running, including a description and the CPU and the PID, and what services are running. Now, the performance tab is a little bit different than performance monitor in that it can show me CPU, memory, network as well, and it's real time. Now, let's say I want to get a more granular look at all of these things. I can open up Resource Monitor right from here. Now, here's a little tidbit of information for you is that Nano Server, and this is Nano Server can actually open up a task manager, but and it actually shows Resource Monitor, but when you click on that link, nothing happens. There's no Resource Monitor in Nano Server.
Mhm.
So clicking on that link, nothing happens. They just kept the same task manager in Nano Server. You don't need to know that for the exam, but it's just a little fun fact. All right, so again, you can see here all the different CPU counters being counted. I can see here my disk counters being counted, and again, RAM and network as well. If I want to take a look, again, this is real time. In Resource Monitor, I can look at it individually here, or I can look at each tab at the top. So we've seen Performance Monitor, Data Collector Sets, which is as groupings of data being collected at the same time, Task Manager, Resource Monitor. Of course, there's like Event Viewer, which hasn't changed. All these ways that you can monitor your Server 2016 servers, whether it's Server Core, Nano, Standard Data Center with GUI, etc.
So each one of these, from a maintenance standpoint, from a monitoring standpoint, seem to be very important. Data collector sets being one that's fairly interesting. If you haven't used this, if you haven't tested it out in your lab, again, we'll urge you to actually pull it up and see how to configure it in the environment. Now, the other thing that Joe mentioned was the resource manager. We looked
Resource
to
Monitor.
resource monitor that we looked at, and the details around it, the fact you won't be able to run certain things in Nano. But it's great to have that as an option when you're configuring your settings. And we're going to end the section with a practice question. So you plan to deploy a new website to your web server tomorrow. You plan to monitor the amount of requests to the website during the first hour of it going into production. You need to ensure that you can discuss the results in the meeting at the end of the day. How should you collect the information for the meeting?
It's interesting the way that's worded. You need to ensure that you can discuss the results. So probably you have some kind of report that's coming out of that as well.
Mhm.
Right? So A, do I want to load settings into Resource Monitor, not Resource Manager? Do I B, use Performance Monitor to create a report, use Performance Monitor to start the system data collector set, or use Performance Monitor to create a user-defined data collector set? Now, a couple of things here. When you look at the exam, it's very easy to choose A because it's the only one that's not Performance Monitor related. But it's also very easy to exclude A because it's the only one that's not Performance Monitor related. So don't look at that. Don't say, well, it must be or it can't be because of that specific reason, because it's one of these things is not like the others. Look at it as, well, I know that's not going to be Resource Monitor, instead of, well, it's not Performance Monitor like the rest of them. So the rest of it, do you want to create a report view? Do you want to do data collector set or user-defined data collector set? In this case, the answer is going to be D, a user-defined data collector set, which will then allow you to create a report out of that information.
And that's important because you're looking at the user behavior on that system as opposed to
Right.
system behavior. And once that information is found, you can provide it as a report to the right folks on the team. So for this section, monitor and maintain servers, we wanted to make sure that you understand what server patching is all about when you're using WSUS, Windows Updates, how those two work together. We also wanted to make sure you understood the server backup, can be backed up on a Hyper-V host and or a Hyper-V guest. You can use those solutions. WB Admin allows you to do that. And lastly, remember that there are tools out there that you can use for monitoring. Performance
A lot of
Monitor,
tools, a lot of built-in tools.
Resource
So, yep.
Monitor, Task Manager. Again, get used to those tools, data collector sets. These are all terms that, over time you'll get familiar with. Now, again, I really like the monitoring and maintenance server section because it really does help you end the conversation around knowing exactly how to keep keep your Windows Server 2016 environment up and running. In the long run, the intention is really to make sure that you understand all of the pieces that really make Windows Server 2016 continue to work. Even after the exam is done, there are other things that will continue to be added on that you should familiarize yourself. We've done our best to cover as much of the material as possible. We're hoping that this was helpful for you, and we're looking forward to hearing back that you've had a successful run at taking the exam and completing it.
Exactly.
Again, thanks for joining us for this module. In this module 5, we'll be covering implement high availability as part of the Windows Server 2016 certification exam. Now, the importance of this portion of the exam is that you understand how to deal with high availability and the components that come with it. Again, high availability isn't something new in Windows Server
No, no, not at
2016.
all.
It really has been around for a
Yep.
while, and it really is intended to provide, as much high availability platform for the services that you're running under Windows Server 2016. Now, there's a number of pieces to this, so we've tried our best to break it down into different sections that explain a little bit more around how you can do this successfully. If we take a look at what we have, high availability covers Hyper-V replica, implementing what we call live migration, implementing shared nothing live migration,
Yep.
as well as configuring things like CRED-SSP or Kerberos authentication protocols for live migration. So each one of these sections are covered quite in detail to ensure that we have a good understanding of what high availability and disaster recovery options are available in Hyper-V. The first thing that we dive into is understanding what high availability is, right? So what types of levels of availability are there is the first thing that you have
Yeah,
to kind
there's
of
this
understand.
clustering, right? So we're talking about clustering, whether it's host clustering in Hyper-V or guest clustering in Hyper-V, network load balancing. So that's stuff that we're going to take a look at in this section as it relates to high availability in Hyper-V specifically.
Exactly.
Yep.
But there's also continuous availability. In other
Right.
words, if this server goes down, how can I ensure that the rest of the services continue to function once server A goes down? So that continuous availability becomes a factor. Business
Business
continuity.
continuity, yep, and disaster recovery as well.
Yeah, so disaster recovery goes back to knowing if you had a whole site go down that's running Hyper-V or any sort of platform for Windows Server 2016, how can I ensure that the second site or the third site now takes over the IP addressing, the server,
Yep.
requirements, and you maybe built it into the Hyper-V platform so that the VMs are then replicated to the second site and continue running in that platform. So there are different levels of availability that you have to consider, and you have to know the business that you're working with and what the requirements are from the business. So many pieces to this high availability really go into things like network load balancing, storage space directs, right, as well
Yep.
as failover clustering, as we mentioned earlier. Now, high availability again has host clustering. You also have what we call guest
Guest
clustering
clustering, right?
and network load balancing. These are three different scenarios. Host clustering
Yep.
is
Host clustering is basically you have a host machine that's being that has high availability built into it. So the guest machines themselves are highly available. If one goes down, it's still available on another Hyper-V on that cluster. And the applications within the guest do not need to be cluster aware. And that's the important piece here between host clustering and guest clustering. When you're clustering the host, the VMs themselves are highly available. When you're clustering the guests, the applications do need to be cluster aware applications.
the other thing to remember is Hyper-V replicas. And if you've ever worked with Hyper-V, Hyper-V replica allows you to have a copy of that Hyper-V in a different site or different location if for some reason you had some issue within the primary location of the Hyper-V. You'd have to have Hyper-V installed in both servers in both locations, and the servers have to be located behind some firewall or the same firewall so that you can actually have
Yep.
that failover happen at that time. So Hyper-V Replica is also an important portion of this exam. Make sure you understand how it works as well. Implementing failover clustering is another form of high availability that we look into. But again, as you can see in this section, we've listed out a number of areas that the exam tests your knowledge and understanding. Everything from scale-out file servers to cluster shared volumes to implementing VM resiliency and VHDX as a storage solution for guest clusters. Each one of these are important to ensuring that you can maintain your services by ensuring that failover clustering does what it's intended to do.
Now, one thing that we've mentioned is failover clustering isn't new to Server 2016. We've talked about that. But what is new to Server 2016 is the idea that we can upgrade the operating system of the cluster. It had kind of a rolling upgrade of the cluster. And we call that cluster operating system rolling upgrade, ironically enough. Again, a rolling upgrade of the cluster operating system rolling upgrade.
And you can also take
Yep.
advantage of things like live migration clusters, where you're basically doing the migration to another set of VMs and you're live migrating that content over, as well as live migration without a cluster. So those are options that are available on the platform. but know exactly what the properties of the failover cluster are, what it looks like. Because again, when you're installing the failover cluster feature in Windows Server 2016, it's another feature, it's another
Right.
configuration. And those servers are built specifically to act as failover clusters in a set of specific nodes. Now, the other thing to remember is failover, the terminology around failover cluster are listed here. We start with the node, knowing the services or applications running within the failover cluster. Are they using shared storage, external storage that is accessible to a clustered node? Do we have a quorum or witness, right? A quorum basically allows you to have another third, a quorum that determines when the cluster needs to
When the
fail over to
Yep.
another platform, and a witness that is participating in the voting process to say, hey, I have a number of services still up. Please allow me to switch over or not.
The term like failback, which is when it does automatically fail over to another node within the cluster, or the cluster clients for each node in the. So we have the whole list of terminology, node locations here. I don't have to read them to you, right?
Exactly. But
Pause the video, take a look.
now, active, passive are also important. Active means that I have two servers running a specific service, and both of them are providing that level of service and maintain
Two or
that.
more.
Yeah, two
Yeah,
or more.
two
You
or
can
more.
have
Yep.
2, 4, 8, a number of different
Yep.
clustered nodes. You can have active passive. In other words, if one server goes down,
Then it wakes up.
then the other server realizes that server A is down
Yep.
and server B takes over the services and continues running. So failover cluster is a fairly modern technology, and it continues to improve with Windows Server
Right.
2016, as you can see here. So know your terminology. Also, software-defined data center or software-defined storage, how you actually configure your storage. Make sure that you're aware of what we're dealing with when we're talking about compute clusters, what type of clusters that we're talking about. The fact that you can actually virtualize the workloads to generate, I/O to the connected file shares. In other words, you want to speed up the connection to the file shares, and you want to be able to have that data replicate and the backup operations on a separate network as well. Scale-out file servers, again, allow you to have a number of file servers utilized to as a storage head node, which can connect to the underlying storage in the backend. So you'll have 3 or 4 scale-out file servers, and then you'll have storage spaces direct on the in the backend serving up those disks. So those file servers act as a front end, while those disks also act as a backend for storage access. And if you're using a JBODs or just a bunch of disks on the back end, you can also build in the fault tolerance when you have the storage spaces direct built into it.
I love when you unacronym JBOD because it's just a bunch of disks.
Just a bunch of
It's
disks.
just
So
a bunch
simple.
of disks.
Yeah, as long as you remember that, just a bunch of disks. Oh, okay. And then disk enclosures, right? So we can actually take advantage of disk enclosures. A disk enclosure, again, is if I have 10, 15, 20, 100 different JBODs, I can actually take those disks and put them into a disk container and treat it as a single volume of storage. And then I can actually use the storage spaces directs or the shared SAS disk enclosure to carve out what's needed for disk. This is a value that we see in software-defined storage. It's an option when we're talking about what Windows Server 2016 can do natively in its platform. So software-defined storage, something to remember, something to keep in mind as you're preparing for the exam. So remember, you still have options to choose. So in the exam, as you're walking through different case scenarios or business scenarios, remember traditional SAN still matters. I know this is kind
Build through
of still shows the details, but this is kind of showing you what a traditional SAN is. And again, for storage area networks, we're talking about the components that are available.
And then you can see some of those are new to Server 2012 R2. So if you've been playing with Server 2012 and high availability and the software-defined storage and stuff like that, we do list what's new to Server 2012 R2 and carried on to Server 2016. The rest of that is not new to even to R2, but it is part of Server 2016 as well.
But see that software-defined storage and traditional SAN have a number of differences. One of the main differences is things like SMB Direct, SMB3 Direct, which are built in, and new in R2, I'm sorry, new in 2016 are things like storage QoS, quality of service, how well am I servicing my storage requests storage replicas, being able to replicate your storage from one set of storage components to another. And as Joe mentioned earlier, rolling cluster updates are fairly new. And Azure Consistent Storage, where you're basically backing up your storage into the cloud. So these are all options that you have available. And you can also take advantage of this using SMB3. Traditional SAN solutions use either Fibre Channel or iSCSI, as you can see. And these are much more expensive, and require additional software and configuration to make them work. Now, again, it's not that they won't work. It's just we want to be much more efficient in the process. In this
Yeah, you
next,
can see that right here, right? So we're taking a look now at the shared serial attached to the SCSI and the iSCSI fiber channel we were just talking about. Yep. So again, you can see the fiber channel has better performance than iSCSI, but as Alfred alluded to, it's more expensive.
Mhm.
So
And
yep,
but most of the time, if an organization already has fiber channel, they'll typically keep it
yeah, they'll
because of the
keep it.
cost, and it is actually a very efficient way of managing access to resources. However, if you're new to the Windows Server 2016 platform and you want to be able to put things up and configure it fairly quickly using storage spaces, the SAN technology with SMB3, and all of the solutions around the Windows Server 2016 may be your quickest way to get the best performance and maybe even better performance than what we've seen in the past. Then also creating a failover cluster is also important because again, this is really diving into installing the roles in the cluster node, creating a clustered role by using Snap-in, and just testing failover. Now, I've worked in organizations where we actually walk through and test this process
Of
over and over
course.
again
Yep.
because maybe something wasn't correct, there's a file that's not in the right place, there's a policy or permission that hasn't been configured correctly. But in the end, if you set up a failover cluster, what you end up with is a storage enclosure where you can actually see the storage. And some workflow PowerShells are only workflow PowerShell. Some workflow PowerShell only, and we'll see that you'll see the workflow that's showing up here. But then you also have the ability to see what we call the full provisioning and management. So the idea is that storage replication is also important. We have a number of different scenarios around storage replication. Synchronous replication, I talked about that, where you have data being synchronized between two
Yep.
different locations. The storage is agnostic, the mirroring of the data in physical sites, where it also ensures that there's no loss or zero data loss at the volume level. The data is always there. We see an increase in resilience, right?
Right, even from site to site, different geographic location type of cluster aware. So synchronizing, if you will, within that cluster, even in two different, metro distance, if you will.
Exactly. And then streamline management. In other words, you can use the graphical management tools for each of the individual nodes and clusters throughout the failover cluster manager and also the ASR, or Azure Site
Yep.
Recovery. You're looking at the same console to recover data from a different site from one by one. Storage Spaces Direct, we've mentioned it a few times, but again, this section covers what Storage Spaces Direct is. I just want to make sure you guys know that's still an option. And this really dives into, the different options for the new architecture when it comes to SSD or, Storage Spaces Direct. Now, you can see a number of Hyper-V clusters running on SMB storage. The Fabric, is a set of solutions that the storage actually runs on. Storage Spaces Direct with the use of Scale-out file server. Think of this as a file server with a number of storage disks associated with them, right? And the more file servers I have, the more options I have to go request access to storage disks. Now, these storage disks are now shared amongst the architecture, and this allows for scaling from a Hyper-V clusters perspective and high availability
Yep.
because of the continuous availability of those file shares on that space, right?
And we listed here even the steps on how to create that, right? So first you build out the Windows Server cluster,
Mhm.
enable Storage Spaces Direct, configure the storage pool. And so we actually listed out the spaces because you may get a question like this on the exam where the steps are on the left-hand side that have to be clicked and dragged to the right-hand side in the appropriate order. So we did list that order for you here, just in case you get a question like that.
And again, we also mentioned that the file shares provide storage for just the Hyper-V host and utilizes SMB3. Best performance you can possibly get will come from SMB Direct with the RDMA, random.
Direct memory
Yes,
access.
exactly.
Yep.
Now, more details around this is it basically designs much of that to support the reliability, the scalability, and some of the use cases.
Use case Hyper-V, IaaS storage, right?
Exactly.
Some
So
of the
just know when you need to use storage spaces direct. They're very important, and they're something that you will be challenged on in the exam. They provide data resiliency, as we mentioned, in the form of data mirroring, in which 2 or 3 of the copies of all the files are written to different disks, or parity at a bit level technique that provides the ability to recover from a disk failure by reconstructing the lost data using what we call parity bits. And here's another scenario in which we have what we call a hyper-converged storage and compute with storage spaces direct. When we talk about hyper-converged, what we're referring to is you can have a number of different areas of technology, not just storage spaces, but the virtual machines, the
file
clusters,
systems,
the
right?
file systems, the storage spaces, the storage pools, all sort of made highly available through the architecture. And at any point in time, there's redundancy built into any one of these. So that's where we talk about hyperconverged storage. They're all using the same storage network or software storage bus, but they're all made highly available on a platform that is highly resilient. So this is a great way to save cost and become much more efficient, ensuring that they're all using the same level of storage, but separated based on the role and the expectation of that storage space. If we're going to manage failover clustering, we want to configure role-specific settings and configure failover and preference settings. And lastly, enable and configure node fairness. In other words, making sure there's a balance between those two nodes. So Hyper-V clustering, or the failover clustering, has an integrated solution. Is something that we're seeing with Server 2016, and we've mentioned this a few times. So it allows for the what we call the resiliency of the failures. For example, if something fails on one of the Hyper-V systems, it will then switch over to VM number 2 or the host number 2 and continue running because the shared storage is shared amongst all 3 of those Hyper-V hosts. So Hyper-V clustering is a technology that allows you to have high availability. Now, I would only be concerned is if this shared storage becomes corrupt.
Right, exactly.
Then that becomes your single point of failure.
Right. In this case, the storage is the point of failure, not the VM itself. So if the VM falls out of the cluster, it'll continue to run.
Unless you have a backup plan for your
Right.
shared storage. So we typically recommend that you have a backup plan for your shared storage just to keep things up and running. And we also mentioned that the storage resiliency is important, making sure we're have the VM stack, and the VM stack is quickly, intelligently notified if the failure happens at any point in time. Here's an example of where the failure occurs, and it automatically does the recovery by retaining the data and getting it back up to par, and then it makes the connection back to that storage itself. We also have quarantining, and for example, if there's something that needs to be worked on a specific node, we can actually quarantine it, move the VMs to a separate node, remove that system for the time being until we're able to resolve the issues on that node. And again, the guest clustering, which is running a cluster shared volume within a VHD. So you have a number of shared volumes that a VHD shares, or the volume shares. And again, this is guest clustering because you're not running it on the host, you're running it on the guest.
Within the guest.
So again, another area to be familiar with when you're taking the exam. And we've listed out a few items that basically tell you more around why the guest clustering matters when it comes to shared VHDXs. The shared VHDXs can reside on a cluster shared volume, on a block storage, or even on an SMB file-based storage. And the last portion of this is managing VM movements in a cluster. Well, not maybe the last
The
portion.
next portion.
Right. We talk about live migration, quick migration, storage migration. How do we migrate our data from one system to another? How do we export our data from one system to another? How do we configure our VM network health protection? So how do we drain a specific set of hosts so that there are no VMs running on it until we patched it or updated or removed it and then added, bring that back? So you have to know the difference between what live migration is and quick migration. Again, live migration is I don't need to take the host down. It basically copies the guest memory transfer, the state transfer, and does a cleanup for you, and it does the migration setup all at the same time. Quick migration allows you to have the machines placed in sort of a save state, and then it actually requires requires downtime while the data is being moved from one host to another.
That's the important piece actually for the exam is the question will likely be worded as, the requirement is no downtime. So if the requirement is no downtime, you need to know is it live migration or quick migration that does the no downtime, and it would be the live migration. A quick migration does require you to shut down the VM during the migration process.
When you're moving VMs in a clustered node, you also have to know what those differences are, and we've just listed them here.
Yep.
Quick migration, we talked about, live migration. Storage migration, again, that's moving the actual
The
storage
storage to
from
another
one
host.
host to another,
Yep.
and then exporting and importing those VMs. Every time you want to move that, you can actually export and import VMs much easier using PowerShell as well. Also understand what NHP is, or Network Health Protection. Again, this is available in Server 2012 R2 and should now be available in Server 2016.
Is now available in Server 2016.
And is now available in Server 2016. So this just goes back to when a host shuts down during a drain, what do you need to do? We talked about the fact that it's going to save the virtual machine state, turn off the virtual machine. I think this was a challenge that I had at one point.
You can even see here on the during a drain or shutdown, what happens if the host is Server 2008 or earlier? What happens if the host is Server 2012 or later, which would include 2012 R2 and 2016? Whether it does actually perform a quick or a live migration. So you can see that we've listed that here as well. It's based on the operating system on what happens.
Yep. And then implementing network load balancing, NLB, so configuring how you can deal with network nodes, port rules, cluster operation modes, and upgrading the NLB cluster. Again, this hasn't changed since Server 2012 R2. If you're familiar with this, then you should understand how you can set up how you can address the concerns around network load balancing for cluster addressing, because there's a cluster address, there's an IP address for the nodes that you have assigned, and when you set up NLB, all that traffic will go to that single address, but then it will be parsed to the two different nodes of address. So facts for the Server 2016.
That's just a vocabulary one, the first one. When you add or remove a node from an NLB, it's actually just known as convergence. We actually mentioned convergence a couple of minutes ago. And then NLB can only detect the server failure, like not an application failure, but a server failure. And then a couple of other facts there. It can have up to 32 nodes, and Alfred was just talking about unicast, again, versus multicast traffic.
And again, unicast versus multicast. Again, unicast might be where when you can configure an NLB cluster to use the unicast mode, all cluster hosts use the same unicast MAC address. So the outgoing traffic uses a modified MAC address that is determined by the cluster's host. When you deal with multicast, when you configure an NLB cluster to use a multicast, each cluster host keeps its original MAC address, but also is assigned an additional multicast MAC address as part of the process. So that's it. And then there's also what we call
Internet Group Management,
exactly.
IGMP.
And it is a special form of multicast mode that prevents the network switch from being flooded with traffic, right? So when you deploy the IGMP multicast mode, the traffic is forwarded only through switch ports that participate in the NLB cluster,
yep.
Right? So it's only looking for that traffic that's coming through. So know the difference, know the facts that you're looking for Server 2016 and what to expect. The other things to consider is the stateful application versus stateless applications, ones that are looking for, that need to go through NLB or have to go to a specific network. Sometimes those applications don't know how to use network load balancing. The stateful application will do that. Also, key workloads that might come up. For example, the web applications and things of that nature. So lastly, we're going to cover the practice question. And you have two host servers that run Hyper-V named Server 1 and Server 2. You plan to move a virtual machine named VM1 that runs an LLB application from Server 1 to Server 2. You need to minimize the downtime taken to move VM1. What should you do?
And so that's what we were just talking about, minimizing downtime or no downtime, yes downtime, what are the requirements? So perform a live migration, a quick migration, export and import VM1, or perform a storage migration. And again, this one also shouldn't be a big surprise. The answer here is to perform a live migration, as that will definitely minimize downtime by not actually having any downtime.
Exactly. So that's good to hear. So high availability, again, in this section really covers quite a bit of content from, storage spaces direct all the way to network load
It
balancing.
really does. It's about 25 to 30% of this exam. It's a very large piece of it.
And it feels like
Yeah.
it's a lot more, but it's a
Yep.
technology that, if you don't use it, you'll forget it very easily. So we do expect you to, as you're working through some of your lab scenarios, play around with high availability scenarios, understand what you're actually configuring, whether you're doing a quick migration or live migration, know the difference between, those sort of scenarios, as well as unicast, multicast, and IGMP.
Active, 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 passive. These are terms that we talked about so long ago now, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's
they're
a
still
big,
coming up.
piece. Yeah.
Yeah. So that high availability is very important. We're rooting for you as you prepare for the exam. And again, thanks for staying with us through this module. In this module, we'll be covering implementing Windows containers as it pertains to Windows Server 2016. Now, Windows containers are fairly new. We see it now in Windows Server 2016 because it allows you to isolate access to specific sets of resources that are available on the Windows Server 2016 platform. It also allows for rapid deployment of the virtualized solution, isolating the operating system for different components on the
Yeah,
platform.
so we say it's new, and it is new. It's new to Server 2016, but it really came from the whole application virtualization, sandboxing of applications or settings or whatnot. So this is really what containers came from. Now, when you use your study time in this exam, keep in mind containers are about 10% of this exam. It's not a big chunk of the exam when you look at the Microsoft Learning page. It's just about 5 to 10% or 10 to 15%. It's not a lot. So spend time studying and learning containers, but I would say don't overdo it with your study time.
Well, they'll still challenge you on things like deploying Windows containers
Absolutely.
and implementing Windows containers. So be familiar with those terms like Dockers, what are Dockers, and we'll look at some of those now as we uh, dive a little further into the content that we have available for you. So if we were to look at deploying Windows containers, you see a number of different areas that you have to be familiar with. Determining installation requirements, installing base operating systems, tagging a name, all the way down to creating a Hyper-V container.
Mhm.
What do I need to do to make sure that I can have containers work as expected? Virtualization has been an important watchword since the early days of Windows, and virtual memory has been around for decades. So Windows can use disk spaces to make the system seem like it has more memory than it has. And that's where the deploying of Windows containers really matter. What is a container?
So I like to think of a container like a cargo ship, right? So you have this ship, and we've all seen them docked as we're driving past a wharf, and they all have all these individual crates, and all these crates have individual items in it being shipped by different companies, all just using that ship. So if something happens to one of those crates, it doesn't affect the other crates, and that's really how the container works. If something happens within that virtualized environment in Server 2016, nothing will happen to the other virtualized environments.
So I guess we could probably
Yeah.
walk through the scenario here on this slide, on this section, which we're talking about what is a container. We see actually three different areas: the application, the OS, and the hardware. Now, this is the traditional virtual machine, which equals the hardware virtualization. The other piece that we also have is the containers, where you can actually have the operating system virtualization separated, and you can have things like the application kernel, the applications in the kernel separated from the hardware itself. Now you're seeing where the containers are being basically isolated in separate, containers, and we take it even further because now we're taking different services and components of the service in the OS and putting them in their own specific containers as well.
And this also helps out developers. They're building and packaging their applications into containers. It's easier to stream them down to machines and test them out and update them and actually uninstall them because there's nothing in the operating system itself with that application.
Exactly. So we move this over. Let's take a look at the Windows Server container. We can have things like maximum speed and density because they were taking advantage of the separation from the kernel, and those containers now are running on their own separate set of spindles or
Yeah.
own separate space.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. They're their own separate. They can be given an IP address from DHCP, NAT static, and they're all individual separate containers.
Exactly. And then lastly, we have the isolation plus the performance, where we're basically taking the isolation plus performance and placing them in different locations. So we have Hyper-V on the underlying technology that supports it. Then you have the kernel
Yeah,
running its
it's
own
interesting. The
space.
Hyper-V containers each have their own Windows kernel, as opposed to applications which share that Windows kernel and the containers built on top of it. In a Hyper-V container, they all have their own Windows kernel because it really Hyper-V has the Windows operating system isolated from other Windows operating systems.
And this is basically suitable for what we call a hostile multi-tenant application, which basically one is just hungry for
Right.
additional memory or usage space. So containers are very important because it allows you to isolate separate activities to separate components, so it doesn't take down the whole system. Now, again, this gives you kind of an idea of the containers overview. What I would do if I needed to have a specific file or an application separated, you can see here, C Windows is in a container OS image, and all the components of that is in that specific storage. And I also have C MySQL, but the irony is, even though those two paths look like they're coming from the same location, they're actually placed on two separate disks or two separate storage locations on the actual server that's being used to host the data.
So we were just looking at in the last set of the last slide that there's Windows containers or Hyper-V containers. So that's really the two types of containers, and when you would use one over the other is what you want to know. And what we said is a Hyper-V container, you can run an operating system, and each container has a copy of the Windows kernel. It's just separate from each other. And the Windows containers each have applications installed, not operating systems. And the applications then are isolated from each other, but they share that Windows kernel on the host.
Exactly. And so installation support for just containers itself, we've listed a few commands here. When you're dealing with a new nano server image, you can actually use a different command and say nano containers guest drive and specify the containers information. If you're installing the Windows feature, you can do it manually through the GUI, or you can run the same command. Install Windows feature, containers, or dash name and containers. And here we're specifying an internal IP interface address prefix of what that that name of the container is going to be. And that's associating the network with that name, and also virtual switch name. And we can also set up the virtual network adapters to run within a specific container or host VM. And we can set those adapters to take advantage of MAC address spoofing. So this is our way of basically providing access to containers, but also isolating it from the other processes that need access to those network resources. Docker containers. Again, this is another interesting one because Dockers provide native support for the Dockers in a host image.
It provides tools, APIs, formats for building, supporting, shipping applications. It's really for the developers, and it provides all the tools that they need for creating those applications.
Exactly. So dockerd.exe, you can register Docker as a Windows service, and then it shows up as a service running on the system
and
itself.
It supports both Linux and Windows.
Exactly.
So it's not just a Windows feature.
Managing Windows containers are also just important as installing Windows containers. You're going to still use PowerShell, as we mentioned. You're going to still maintain the containers networks, the data volumes, as well as use the Docker files. So all of these key features in this section of the module become part of what you need to be able to implement, not just configure, but implement. So when we manage containers, we need to think about providing network support for things like network switches or network address table and NAT switches, and understanding how those settings are working on that platform. So we've given you a link on the documentation for Docker, www.docker.com, to find additional information, as well as Windows Server 2016. You'll find data there in that same location. In this section, we'll have a quick practice question, and the question goes like this. Your company is developing an application named App1 that will run on Windows Server 26. App1
2016.
2016, yeah. 26 is no longer. App1 is very resource intensive. You plan to deploy App1 onto a new Windows Server 2016 server. You need to ensure that App1 does not interfere with other applications running on the same server. How should you deploy App1? Now, keep in mind everything we just learned and how you would select the answer.
So create a Gen 2 virtual machine, create a Nano server instance, create a Windows Server container, or create a Hyper-V container. In this case, again, App1 is very resource intense, and we're going to deploy App1 onto a new Windows Server. So that's what's important in this case. And the questions aren't written to trick you, and they're not written to test your reading comprehension, but they want to make sure you understand what's the requirement of your customer or of your boss. In this case, you are using a new Windows Server 2016, so the answer is going to be a Hyper-V container. Because within that Hyper-V container, we will install that new Server 2016 or 2016 instance and install the application into that.
So a few tips and tricks for preparing for the exam. First, find out by experimenting on Docker. www.docker.com will give you enough information. Learn about those Docker technologies and use the website to learn more and keep up to date.
You can even go to docs.docs.docker.com
There you go.
for more information.
And understand when to deploy a container or a VM or a physical
machine.
They're all different ways of deploying components of the platform, but know why you would do one versus the other and when to turn on those features. Again, we want to thank you for joining us for the Hyper-V containers, the containers discussion. Again, containers are very exciting once you get to using it and understanding how they work, how they isolate access. As you prepare for the exam, use this material to assess the areas of technology around containers that you do not have, and it will help you prepare for the exam. Again, thank you for joining this module. In this module, we cover implementing Hyper-V. Hyper-V, again, is a hyper-virtualization solution that's been integrated into Windows Server 2016. It's been around for a little while, and we've seen it used quite a bit.
It has, and we've improved on it in Server 2016, where we have nested virtualization. We'll talk about that. If you saw some of our other series, we showed you that already, where you can have a VM within a VM now with Hyper-V.
The Hyper-V itself allows you to run virtualized versions of Windows Server 2016, but when you're configuring it, it still requires you to provide information like storage requirements, virtual network requirements, disk configurations, as well as quality of service requirements. All of those are built right into the actual Hyper-V platform. So as we dive into this, we wanted to share with you the importance of what it means to set up Hyper-V. So in this section for this exam, the things that you need to be thinking about is determining things like the hardware requirements, how to install Hyper-V, the management tools around Hyper-V, all the way down to, as Joe mentioned, the nested virtualization. As we mentioned before, Windows PowerShell and Windows PowerShell Direct are also very important for this exam component. As we dive into it, here are some of the key hardware requirements that are necessary when installing Hyper-V. Of course, the 64-bit CPU is a prerequisite with the
second layer address translation processor. Now, in the first module, we talked about the hardware requirements for Server 2016. It said based on the role of that server, you may need additional hardware requirements. In this case, you do need that SLAT processor, again, second layer address translation, to enable the virtualization itself.
Right, so that virtualization support is also required for BIOS to UEFI. Yep. You have to have that installed. And what's a quick way to actually validate what you have configured on your device?
That's a good question. So what you can see on my screen is I have my domain controller running right now. And if I just go into a command prompt, and I can type in systeminfo.exe, you'll be able to see at the bottom of this list, first of all, I can see a lot of information about it. That's not what this lesson's about. But at the bottom of this list, you can see, yes, a hypervisor has been detected. Features required for Hyper-V won't be displayed, but if it's not there, that it will be displayed. So everything now is available. Now, I'm running this within a VM. So there are things that I had to do on my host machine first, and we'll get to that in just a moment, to ready my host machine to allow that processor to follow through, that hypervisor to go into my VM. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So on this machine, I am good to go on installing Hyper-V if I wanted to. Again, it's just command prompt and system info.
Just some of the things to remember when you're running Hyper-V is that the guest operating systems that are supported are anything from Windows Vista to Windows 10, anything from Windows Server 2008 all the way up to Windows Server 2016, as well as Linux or FreeBSD. These are all technologies that are supported on the Windows or the Hyper-V platform. Now, remember, Windows Server 2016 comes in 3 different software requirements. For example, you can have it in GUI mode. You can also have it in Server Core and also Nano Server.
Yeah, Nano Server as well, yep.
So they all support Hyper-V virtualization. And the other thing that we want to mention is just that TPM is also needed for shielded VMs. So if you have shielded VMs, you can take advantage of that. And the UEFI has to be at least 2.3.1c.
Which it is. That's today's UEFI requirement.
Yep. So again, the tip we want to mention is for the exam, remember that you can actually find this information by running systeminfo.exe. But keep in mind that installing the Hyper-V component is really, if you're using PowerShell command, all you're going to do is type in install-windows
A Windows
feature,
feature.
space
Yep.
name, Hyper-V.
Right. And of course, we could go into, again, going back into my domain control if we wanted to. We can go into Server Manager. And of course, manage, add roles and features, and add the Hyper-V role.
Exactly.
So that can always be done as well. So next, 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 and look for Hyper-V. Install Hyper-V. Oh, I think I just missed it. Yep, install Hyper-V. Add these features as well. I'm going to stop here because I'm not going to bore you with installing Hyper-V. Again, install Windows feature PowerShell command. It'll go right through the Server Manager.
You could also use DISM to do the installation of the Hyper-V. So as you can tell, there are a number of different ways to actually install Hyper-V on the platform.
Yep.
Now, the other thing to remember is that once you install it, you can actually use the virtual machine manager components built into the GUI to actually manage the Hyper-V platform. So the Hyper-V manager, as Joe has shown, also is a place where you can manage resources.
And we have a screen grab right there as well for what Hyper-V manager looks like. Yep.
So Joe, what exactly is PowerShell Direct?
That's a good question. It's an easy way to manage your Hyper-V guest systems by using PowerShell. And you can run PowerShell on your host system by running a PS session, then VM name and the name of the VM, and actually connect into your VM and run the PowerShell command right from the host. Of course, the guest needs to be up and running, but doesn't need to be logged in. It can be a server core again, or Nano server. It's just a way of doing a remote PowerShell from your host into your guest.
So all I have to do is know the name of the guest itself. So I'd enter the PS name, the PS session, and then the host name or the guest name.
Enter PS session, VM name, -VM name, and the name of the VM. And then you can do things like invoke command and stuff like that within there.
The typical, yeah. So it saves a little bit of time. So PowerShell Direct is, again, something you may see on this exam, and we expect you to sort of ramp up on it, make sure you've tried it in your own labs, and understand how it works.
Now, something to consider with PowerShell Direct is it only works on your Windows 10 machines running Hyper-V and your Server 2016 machines running Hyper-V. So this is something new, right? This is not something that got ported from Server 2012 R2. It's new to Server 2016 and Windows 10.
So the other thing we have to think about is when you upgrade from Windows Server to the latest version of Hyper-V, you're going to take advantage of a number of different features where you can actually use tools like export. You can have options to do what we call Hyper-V replicas. They're all built into the latest platform. So upgrading your Hyper-V platform is also important. It comes with the Windows Server 2016 upgrade process as well. Nested virtualization gets really interesting as well because that's also part of this. Tell us a little bit about that.
So nested virtualization, we've mentioned this a couple of times now. And basically what that means is I have my Hyper-V service running on my host machine. Inside of that, I put a Server 2016 virtual machine. Inside of that, I run the Hyper-V service, and I have VMs running. So I have a VM within a VM. And this is it's a pretty cool feature because this is brand new to Server 2016 and Windows 10's Hyper-V. Now you can see the command set VM processor. What this needs to be configured on the host first, and we have that command there. And if you've seen our 70-741 series, I've already run this because I showed you some of the nested virtualization technologies.
What if they haven't?
And then go watch our 70-741 video series. You're going to watch that anyway because that's also one of the exams needed for the MCSA, MCSE. Anyway, that said, you do need to run that exposed virtualization extensions $true PowerShell command. And what that does is it brings the hypervisor from the guest into the host, from the host into the guest machine. That needs to be run while the virtual machine is powered down. So make sure it's not an in-production machine that's running a workload. And if it is, make sure you have a maintenance window for that because it does need to be powered down before you can run that command on your host machine.
Excellent. So you can also do things like configure dynamic memory on the Hyper-V. There are a number of different settings in the Hyper-V component or console that you can actually make changes on that specific Hyper-V setting.
Yeah, it's interesting too because you can do things while your virtual machine is running, like change the amount of memory. But what you cannot do while the machine is running is add a hard drive, add a hard disk.
Exactly.
So if you need to add a hard disk, shut down the machine. If you want to add memory, you can do that while it's running.
The next section covers configuring virtual machine settings, as I just recently mentioned. Add or remove memory running in the VM, as Joe mentioned. Dynamic memory, smart paging, for example, might be something that you need to know. know the difference between Generation 1 and Generation 2 VMs. Generation 1 being VMs that are built off of the VHD component and utilize BIOS as a back end for the disk configuration, and Gen 2 disks use the VHDX and utilize UEFI as well as Secure Boot and other scenarios to take advantage of securing the VHD itself. Also, much of this covers just Linux integration, FreeBSD integration, all part of the exam content. Again, if we take a look at the console and we look at the VM settings, we see the non-uniform memory access spanning, dynamic memory, CPU usage, integration services, and smart paging, and a number of different or other paths that might actually help you to and understand what you're doing and how you're
Yep.
using the Hyper-V platform for configuration. So be sure to explore all the options. Everyone that's running Windows till that it's enabled the Hyper-V feature have the ability to look at the platform and determine what are the things that they need to know for the exam.
Yep. And if you take a look at my screen now, I have my host machine's virtual machine manager up and running. And I'll just go to the settings of my SVR01. Why not? And so add hardware. Again, I can add a network controller right here. If I wanted to add an extra NIC card, and the reason I might do something like that is to make it into a running remote access server, something like that. I don't have to shut that down first. I can change my memory while my machine is up and running. This machine is up and running. Here's my processor. And again, as we're just talking about all these different things that you can do, including hardware acceleration on the network card, some advanced features, MAC address spoofing, and DHCP guard, making sure that this guest machine, if DHCP is installed, can't actually hand out IP address to my production environment. So all these features are available within the Hyper-V console.
And remember, non-uniform memory access, or NUMA, is a way of prioritizing how traffic is sent through, the memory is sent through specific channels. For example, if you want all your memory, all of the information being sent through a single memory channel in SQL, it allows you to do that so that it's actually much more optimal in terms of performance. So that's a big difference that you see. You won't, there's no NUMA button, but there at least you know exactly that it's taking advantage of NUMA as part of the configuration. So the other thing we mentioned, Gen 1 versus Gen 2, also know that Gen 1, the hardware differences between Gen 1 and Gen 2 when you're building the disk itself, you can see some of those here where we are able to use different types of disk.
This is actually on the virtual machine, right? So if you can see on my screen, I'm going to go ahead and show you that. I won't follow through with the whole process again because, it's boring. But Server 1, right-click, New Virtual Machine. And the first thing it wants to know is name, where do I want to store it? Again, boring stuff for this demo. But is it a Gen 1 or a Gen 2 virtual machine? Now, this virtual machine is basically the settings that will be run when the virtual hard disk is attached to it. So this is basically the settings for the VM itself. We can set in here. Again, if it's going to be a Gen 1, it supports 32-bit and 64-bit, or Gen 2 is only 64-bit, UEFI-based firmware, again, and virtualization features. So depending on the role of the guest itself, that's when you're going to want to determine if it's a Gen 1 or a Gen 2. This is not something you'll change after the fact. You'll build it as a Gen 1 or as a Gen 2.
And smart paging is also another feature that you see in Hyper-V that enables the host server to basically compensate when the memory is overcommitted to a specific server. So at that point, what happens, it's able to say, well, I need to, decide on how to provide additional pages for any overcommitted, set of resources on the system. So configuring smart pages are also important for this exam. Make sure you're aware of it. And we also have configuring Hyper-V storage. Now, this is the storage backend. We talked about the VHDs, the VHDXs, and configuring the differencing disk. We mentioned that earlier. And pass-through disk. In other words, you have a physical disk, and you're passing through the request directly to that physical disk as if it's a virtual disk. These are options where you want to increase or improve performance. All the way down to quality of service or QoS configurations. The Hyper-V storage talks about the storage standpoint of what you need to think about. Now, we've mentioned this a few times now, VHD, the different formats. Using a VHD, which is a classic format, it allows for backwards compatibility. One thing to remember is when you're copying VHDs to the cloud, you can only copy VHDs.
It's funny. It's interesting that you can't do VHDXs,
at least
not just
as
yet,
of this recording.
as of today. And let's go ahead. We may as well say that. things are moving fast in Redmond, right? Things are moving fast in Redmond and things are moving fast in Microsoft Learning. We've talked about that before and we'll talk about it again. So as of today, as we're recording this, when you go to import your virtual machine into the cloud, it has to be a VHD. It cannot be a VXX file. That could change. So make sure you keep up with TechNet articles and with the Microsoft Learning page for this exam so you know when it was updated.
Also know the difference between fixed disks, dynamically expanding disks, and differencing disks.
So a
Essentially-
fixed disk, your parent disk will be a fixed disk, and even some of your normal, even if you don't have a parent differencing disk relationship, you could still have fixed disk. What you want to remember is that a fixed disk is always going to take up 60 gig, 260 gig of hard
Exactly.
disk space, or a dynamically expanding will grow to a specific point, but it'll grow for you. It doesn't take up the 250 gig or whatever right away.
Know when to use one versus the other. They all have their purposes and they all have their benefits.
Now, say fixed disk 10 times
Yeah, I
fast.
know, right? Shared VHDX files are sort of a way of dealing with cluster shared volumes, or sharing files amongst a number of VHDX. They're going to write to the same set of files. It's a way of basically having simultaneous access to read and write to those specific files as themselves. The primary use case is when you have to do what we call guest-based VM clustering.
Mhm.
So you have a number of guest VMs, and you basically say, I want each one of these to share that same VHDX, and they'll see each one of those in each one of the VMs. You can write to each one of those, and you read from each one of those as if they were all using their own separate disk, but it's shared amongst the group of them. That's a really cool function that I think is
is.
great, and be prepared for that on the exam as well. We also have configuring Hyper-V networking, which goes into setting up your VNICs, dealing with MAC addresses, VM queues, remote direct memory access or RDMA, as well as configuring the bandwidth management. We have here an example of where you would actually remove or add your network interface card. This is typically seen when you're looking at deciding the type of network adapter to use. The legacy adapter used what we call the Gen 1 VMs,
Yep.
and it was literally fairly limited because it could only use up to like 100 megabits per second. Now with the newer network adapters, we can use either Gen 1 or Gen 2 support, and it has a much
It has
higher,
a much higher throughput. Yeah.
exactly, 10 megabytes per connection. And you can also have Pixie support for the virtual machines. Again, legacy network adapters only supported that in Gen 1, but native supports in Gen 2 network
Now,
adapters.
one thing to consider is before you build your VM, I'm going to go ahead and open up my virtual machine console again on my server 1. Before I build my VM, and I do have my nested VM here, so I'm going to show you this in the settings, that I have a network card, and here it is right here. Now, where did this come from, and why do I have not connected only this one? It comes from the virtual switches that you have installed, so let's go ahead and install virtual switch. So my virtual switch manager is on my Hyper-V server itself, and I have one external switch, and I can go ahead and say, I'm going to go ahead and create an internal one. I'll just call it internal. And then I can decide this is going to be an internal or it's going to be private. For the most part, you're going to create, they have 3 choices to create: external, internal, and private. And it automatically thinks it's going to be internal because I said I wanted to create an internal one. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK there. And I'm going to create one more virtual switch for private. And the difference between them, external allows me to share my network connection with my host, getting me out to the internet from within the VM.
Internal basically allows you to have internal network connections and sort of have your own private LAN, if you
Yep.
may, in the VM itself. So many times when you set up an internal connection, it's really just for having a connection only from the host itself
Right.
to the clients. And I typically see this when I'm trying to provide just single access from a single VM to the actual sets of the VM hosts to the sets of VM guests that are on the machine itself. So understand where when you're dealing with internal connections, external connections, as well as private connections.
So I did finish up creating that private network connection. So if you go back to my screen, you can see now I can take my VM settings. I can actually change the network adapter. I now have all 3 available. I can do my external, my internal, and my private are all available to me now because I added those network switches.
These all take advantage of what we call bandwidth management.
Yep.
We can still use VLAN IDs. You can use SIROV. single root I/O virtualization, and virtual machine queues. Now,
Yep.
just queuing up information or memory that needs to be sent to specific
And as we talked about a few
storage.
minutes ago, they can all do MAC address. You can do a static MAC address or MAC address spoofing. Again, MAC address spoofing is actually disabled by default. But there's also DHCP guard and router guard to make sure that the VM cannot be used as a DHCP server or to give IP addresses to the outside network, or same thing with a router. And that's really to make sure that none of your malicious users are creating that to redirect traffic.
We can also use NIC teaming. And now NIC teaming is taking a network interface card or a virtual network interface card and combining it with a second virtual network interface card. The benefit now is that I have double the throughput or the higher availability in terms of throughput when it comes to network connections. So we've pasted a quick command, new VM switch, with the name of the external team that you're trying to do and the adapter name. So I'm basically saying NIC1, NIC2 should create a third network virtual switch and call it external teams, and all the traffic will go through the external teams. Now, again, there are some requirements, so this is again something to be aware of on the exam. These adapters must be identical with the same version or driver version. When you set it automatically, when the multiple network adapters are used, it's very easy to work that way. And you can also combine the network adapters into a team with up to about 8 different network adapters. Again, that's an extreme case.
Yep.
It just depends on what you're trying to do.
And we just showed you the network, the advanced network settings, the MAC address. This is where, if we're on stage legs, anyone have any questions about MAC address spoofing or static MAC address? I said that you can create a static MAC address, and the screen grab showed that as well. And when would you create a static MAC address? Is if you have nested VMs and you want them all to have within the same, not the same MAC address, but within the same network. You might do something like that. Just something that you can control.
So you mentioned DHCP guard,
Yep.
protecting the DHCP addresses, router advancement.
Router guard.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. Protected networks, which is just protecting the different sets of networks. So these are things we want to think about as we're preparing for the exam. These are considered advanced topics, but you can actually go out there and learn them and be very good at it as well. So one practice question before we kind of move on to the next module is, you plan to deploy a Hyper-V-based nested virtualization solution onto a number of servers. The nested servers need access to the internet. You have the following virtual machines available. You need to identify which servers from the following table can be used for this purpose.
And we have the table, and this is the type of question you will actually see where you have the following servers, the following VM configuration version, or the type of Server 2016 that's installed, and the network configuration. So we have servers 1 through 4. Server 1 is server with GUI, then server core, nano, and also server core, different VM versions. Which servers can you identify that can be used? The nested servers need to access the internet, so which ones are available to allow for that? And so it's server 1 and 2, which is VM configuration 7 and 8, but server core 2 and 3, 1 and 3, 3 and 4. And the answer here, again, I don't think this will surprise anyone, but the answer here is servers 3 and 4 because of the NAT switch on 3. They both have VM configuration version 8.0. MAC address spoofing is configured on server 4. The answer is 3 and 4. And we put a link there as well so you can see how we came up with that answer and make sure that we got the right answer. So
excellent. Yeah. So let's talk about a few tips and tricks that you need to prepare for when you're dealing with Hyper-V on Windows Server 2016. Again, this isn't anything new that we talked about, but remember that you have options, choosing from the external network switch, internal network
and
switch,
private,
and private network switch.
Yep.
Know the difference between that. Understand the hardware and advanced NIC settings like QoS, quality of services, random access memory, any of those.
NIC teaming and router guard.
These
and
are
DHCP
terms that
guard,
you
all the
have to
advanced,
familiar with, exactly, and know how to implement, like Joe said, NIC teaming. NIC teaming in virtual machines is very important because now you'll be able to take more than one network switch and put it together to increase the throughput. Again, these are all terms that we've tried to share with you. Our intention is to give you as much information as possible around the Hyper-V platform as it pertains to Windows Server 2016. We thank you for joining us for this module, and we see you again soon. In Module 2, we cover implementing storage solutions in Windows Server 2016. The importance of this is now you have to be able to manage the storage of the installed Windows Server 2016 platform. We cover many of the features that come along with Windows Server 2016, including configuring disk and volumes, importing server storage, implementing server storage, as well as dealing with data deduplication.
Dedupe.
I
We'll
can
just
never
call
say
it
it.
from now on. It's just dedupe,
Yeah, I
not
have a hard time
deduplication.
saying
Just
it.
he can't talk. Dedupe.
Deduplication. Those are options that are available. When we dive into the content, what we'll notice that is implementing storage solutions are made up of quite a few areas. So we talked about configuring your sector size, your grid partition tables, using VHDs versus VHDXs, mounting virtual hard disks, all the way down to server message blocks.
Right.
These are all components around configuring disk volumes. Now, configuring disk volumes, the fundamental storage technology in Windows Server 2016 hasn't changed from previous version. However, it's still common for us to see this on
Oh,
certification
absolutely.
exams.
Even if the content hasn't changed, we still test you on that just to make sure that you do know the information in this version of Windows.
So some of the things we want you to think about is just determining the partition table format. If I'm going to deal with creating a disk, I need to know what type of disk I'm creating. Am I going to use the master boot record or the MBR format, or am I going to use the GPT format?
I like MBR. It's been around since the 80s. I'm an 80s guy.
Mhm.
So I don't want anything new. I'm
And
good with MBR, right?
And I like GPT because I can have as much size as I want. I like that 2 terabytes. It does what I
Yep.
need it to do.
Of course. And of course, I'm just joking. The idea here is that MBR is old technology, right? Has been around for 30 plus years, MBR.
Exactly. And it was there with the BIOS platform. That's
Yep.
what it was used for. So you'll still see this in questions come up. So make sure you know the difference between what MBR provides and what UEFI provides. Again,
Or
MBR
GPT.
only.
GPT for
Sorry,
UEFI.
GPT.
Yep.
Yes. Keep in mind that it supports a maximum of only 4 primary partitions per drive, which is another reason why we need to kind of move to the GPT. Because now you can have up to 128 separate partitions on a specific drive.
Exactly. And if we go to actually create a drive, and I'm just going to show you in my Hyper-V for right now what I've done to prepare for this. You can see my Hyper-V, and you can see the settings that I have in my in this specific VM. I do have 2 hard drives installed, right? So once I go into my Hyper-V settings or go into my virtual machine, I can go into from Server Manager. I'm just going to lift that up a little bit, maximize my window, Tools to Computer Management. And this just looks the same as it always has in the past. And of course, everything we do here, we can do using tools like, we can use PowerShell, or we can use DiskPart and other tools as well. I'm here showing you the GUI. I have my disk 1, and of course, I can just create a new volume here. And nothing here has changed, so I'm going to create a volume of 5 gig for right now. 4096. We'll do 4 gig, because I can do that math in my head. Next, I'm going to assign drive letter D, or I can mount an empty NTFS folder. This has been around since Server 2003. The ability to, basically, you're calling a folder by drive letter, or don't assign anything at all. I'm going to go ahead and assign drive D. Next, and I want to format this either as NTFS, as FAT, or as ReFS, right? So you want to know the difference here between that. I think we have a slide. We have some information coming up on that. Perform a quick format, allow for file and folder compression. I'm just going to go with all my little defaults here. Next.
Now, again, this is important
Finish.
to know what those options are, because
Yep.
at any point in time during the exam, they might test you on what you need to do to create a modern disk or some sort of disk that relies on GPT, or most likely a GPT, because that's more of the newer format.
Right, exactly.
Now, GPT's been around since Windows Server 2003, so it isn't a new technology per se, but it does take advantage of all of those features.
It is really newly adopted, right? I think a lot of companies have used MBR even since Server 2003. They just kept it with MBR. There was no reason to change that. And I think now we're seeing a lot more data being stored, right? We're seeing terabytes of data. So now you're looking at what can we do for the faster disks, for the larger disk, larger disk partitions, and that's where GPT comes in.
Exactly. So let's take a dive into NTFS and ReFS, and you just mentioned the two earlier. NTFS being the network, I can never remember the NTFS term. So the NTFS itself is
it's the NT, right? It's Windows NT.
Windows NT
File system.
Yeah.
Exactly. NTFS.
New
Windows
tech-
NT, new technology, right?
New
NT4,
technology file
NT
system.
was new technology.
Exactly.
Again, that was back
And
in the
then-
mid-90s, new
Exactly.
technology, file system.
And the other being the resilient file system, or
Right.
the ReFS. NTFS works fairly well. We've listed out each one of these so that you can differentiate between FAT FAT32,
File allocation table.
yes, and
Honestly,
NTFS.
you don't need to unacronym these for the exam. They
We do
won't
it
ask you
because we
that.
want to make sure
Yeah,
you
we
understand what
make
they're
sure that
working
you
on.
understand where they came from, how old they are, what they mean. But for the exam, you don't need to unacronym any of these.
Exactly. So again, remember that the ReFS, the reason why it's becoming a technology is the important technology to remember is because it actually has built-in error checking in the actual file or the boot volume itself. It can actually determine if there's an error and do its own sort of check to resolve that issue, which wasn't available readily in the NTFS,
Right.
FAT
The
forms.
big reason to use ReFS over NTFS, you can see ReFS is backward compatible to NTFS, but because NTFS doesn't have all that error checking and correction, that's where ReFS steps up.
And it actually enhances the
Yep,
features of what NTFS
exactly.
provides. So for the exam, know the difference between what NTFS provides, what FAT32 and provides, as well as ReFS. On the virtual hard disk, we have options around whether you're going to create a virtual hard disk using a VHD option, a VHD option, VHDX option, or now what we call a VHD set. Now, a VHD set is what we call a format that's shared where they're using the shared virtual hard disk only and enables the backup of a virtual machine groups using the shared virtual hard disk as well.
Right. And so if you were going to create a new virtual hard disk, and you can see on my screen, and we have a whole section, a whole module on Hyper-V, but I'll show you right now. If I need to create a new virtual hard disk, I'm just going to open up my Hyper-V Manager, new virtual hard disk, and you can see right away the options here that we're talking about. Do you want that to be a VHD? It supports up to 2 terabytes in size. I'm sorry, 2 terabytes in size. A VHDX for 64 terabytes, or the VHD set that you're talking about. Personally, my lab machine is running low on disk space, so I can't go next finish at this point because I don't have any space to store even a 5 gig hard drive at the moment. So I'm going to cancel out of this.
Exactly. So, and then we also left the command line, sorry, a PowerShell script at the very bottom, new dash VHD, because again, many of these scripts and many of these processes can be implemented using PowerShell. So remember that as well. So we also listed out a number of disk management tools from the server manager, the disk management itself to actually see the disk size, the disk usage, the diskpart being another tool that's more of a command line,
Yep.
diskpart utility, and
And of course,
PowerShell.
PowerShell. PowerShell is all over this exam. I don't think there's a single module out of all 6 of them that won't include some sort of PowerShell. So make sure you do know the PowerShell that comes with Server 2016 or even 2012 R2, because again, a lot of those have come up to 2016 as well.
So what's the difference in disk?
So that's a good question. And I just mentioned that my hard drive, my laptop, my Surface Pro 4, obviously, is running low on disk space. And that's even though I used a parent disk differencing disk. Now, what a differencing disk does, and again, we have a whole Hyper-V module coming up, but what a differencing disk is, it's a virtual hard drive that has base system settings. It has the installed operating system, for example. And then you save it to a location, or you sysprep it, save it to a location, and then mark it as read-only. Now, that one might be 40 gig or 60 gig in size. Then every VM that you create after that one, you create as a differencing disk. It's going to bring in the parent disk, and then over and above that, it's going to add all those differences. Those differences might be running Ubi, the out-of-box experience, installing Active Directory or DNS. And then when that gets saved, it's saved as a differencing disk, so it doesn't also have to take up another 60 gig. It takes up a very small amount of space. Now, again, on my Surface Pro 4, I have a fairly small D drive that I installed this on. So I have a parent disk for my Server 2016, and I have 4 VMs all using differencing disks to keep that space low. So if I did it all as regular, I would have 4 60 gig hard drives. Instead, I have one 60 gig hard drive and a few that are, megabytes in size instead.
Excellent feedback, Joe. And now the other side of that we want to take advantage of is just SMB shares. Now, I don't cover SMB shares here, but the SMB shares itself is really for server message blocks that you can actually create a storage share on your
Yep.
server environment. Implementing server storage kind of takes a deeper dive. So this is what we call configuring storage pools, looking at iSCSI targets, ISNS targets, and multipath IO, MPIO. So even storage replicas are covered here, and server-to-server cluster-to-cluster configurations. Implementing server storage takes another step into the storage world. so that you better understand how to manage these scenarios. Here is a sample of where I have a software-defined storage solution in place. I'd need to add the disk to a pool, create the virtual disk using that pool, and then allow that disk to be thin provisioned, so that it can use that physical space. And then we can also create the volume and the format. So those volumes then represent the logical carved out
Hmm.
space of that disk.
Yep.
Storage space directs allows us to use things like storage, JBODs or SAS disks, so disks that are literally 1 terabyte in size or whatever, and they're basically these disks that are built to be added to a server hardware. You combine them all together, and they sort of act as a pool of disks. So Storage Space Directs takes advantage of that, and it can be configured as a cluster shared volume for applications that need access to a shared drive that's going to host the information about that server.
Right, and as we put there in a nice bold, because maybe as an exam tip, a primary use case of these storage space direct is a Hyper-V VM storage, right?
Exactly. And or Hyper-V VM storage or data on
Right.
the Hyper-V as well. We also need to take a look at the disk layout. So the RAID configuration. How many? I mean, I was going to say, how many people
Tons.
have heard of
Right.
RAID before?
Raise your hand if you've heard of RAID. We do a lot of speaking at conferences, live conferences. Raise your hand, cameras, if you've heard of RAID.
I have.
So yeah, you want to know about the RAID configurations. That's also important on this exam. Now, this is, I believe, 15 to 20% of the exam in storage. So understand the RAID, the simple layouts versus a mirrored layout. Which ones have parity, which ones don't have parity. You should know these. Some of this has changed a little bit from like Windows NT 2000, 2003 up to 2012 R2 and beyond. And some of it is the same. A simple stripe set, for example, is a simple stripe set.
Yeah, two-way mirroring is just mirroring one disk to another. Three-way, you might have a disk that's protected. If for some reason you have three disks with that information
Yep.
stripped across, just think about the type of configuration you're having. Parity again might have three disks with
Right.
information written on
And you can
each
see
one.
as you're creating that storage pool, you can see from the screen grab that we put there, you start creating the storage pool and then,
They'll
uh,
ask you
yeah, and then
whether or
what's
not
the
you
name
want
of
to
it,
use
and then what kind of RAID layout do you want? Do you want
exactly.
it to have parity, not have parity? It's a simple mirror, right? So that's all part of that creation wizard. And of course, you can do with PowerShell with the different parameters to add the right storage layout.
Exactly. So make sure you know the difference here. As iSCSI components, so iSCSI initiate and iSCSI target. What this is you're basically using a connection to the iSCSI target on the network, and you can basically put in a specific IP address or FQDN address to locate what we call the target. Now, the target itself is a storage. It's a SCSI disk that is being accessed through an IP address, and it can appear as a local disk on the machine. It's on the device itself. So we've given you sort of insight as to why we think iSCSI targets are important because it's an installable role on the server. It presents that storage to the network initiator,
Hmm.
so it knows how to read those storage devices and uses software as a service to manage access to the resources that you need access to. It's much cheaper than fiber channel, and of
Yeah,
course,
absolutely.
it's a low-cost solution because it uses the software-based solutioning for storage options. So iSCSI tells you, iSCSI Initiator know exactly what it can do and how to configure it so that you can have a quick connection and setup of the iSCSI components. Storage replicas are also important because now you're replicating data from one storage to another, and you have to allow for different scenarios of what type of data are you replicating over. It takes into account the fact that you might use SMB3, and that's the best solution for storage replication. SMB3 over TCP, you can turn on the RDMA protocol as well to
Yep.
randomly
It's
hide the
remote
memory.
directory, remote memory, direct memory access, RDMA.
Yeah. And then the storage replicas offer both asynchronous, and synchronous replication. In other words, whether or not the replication is happening, where the files or the logs are being written to both location or to one location. In this case, you can have either option as a configuration for your storage replication, but it also supports the use of SAS and JBOD disk, as well as SCSI, SCSI, SATA, or any other sort of disk that you're looking for. Keep in mind that you might want to consider what a stretch cluster is, where you're stretching a cluster from between two different data centers, or if you're using what we call server to server, you're clustering two different servers across the location, or if you're just having a cluster to cluster storage replica. So you're saying, I want these clusters to replicate with those clusters. And at that point, you have a high availability within the clustering platform itself. Data duplication really takes on the idea that I don't want to have to repeat the same information or place the same information in two different locations. So if I have a copy of the Windows Server 2016 image disk, it might have specific files, and I might store it in a specific location on my Windows Server environment. Now, if I'm going to use if I'm going to back up that VHD or the VM, what I want to do is if I see a file called init.ini, I don't want to have to repeat it. I just place a pointer in it to the one location where it's located, so that when I do the backups, I'm only doing it once. When I'm, hosting those files in a specific location, it always knows that that same file is in a specific location based on the backup solution and based on the configuration of the platform.
You find this very useful in case of like a Hyper-V where you have two different VMs that are almost identical. They have a lot of the same files, and you're really paying for storage, and it's a lot of storage to store the same exact folders and files multiple times. And that's where dedupe comes in handy, where it stores it once and it pulls it in as needed on each of the VMs, or in my case for VM, but of course in other scenarios as well.
And configuring deduplication is fairly simple. We have commands that allow you to run the installation. So add Windows features with the name, and you specify the FS data deduplication option. And at that point, you're able to take advantage of configuring deduplication. Now, you can also evaluate deduplication by running the ddpeval.exe file from the WinSystem32 to estimate the gains. And there's a number of different ways you can actually use the configuration of deduplication to determine status. And you can also run a schedule against the files on minimum age and overall default of 3 days old.
Now, there's a couple of new features from Server 2012's Server 2012 R2's dedupe that are now available in Server 2016. Simplified backup support is, they've actually made that simpler, so I don't know if that's new or improved. Support for Nano Server, obviously that would be new because Nano Server is new. There's also support for the rolling cluster upgrades, rolling cluster OS upgrades. That is new with data dedupe for Server 2016. And support for large files, large volumes has just been improved from Server 2012 R2. Make sure you know some of the improved and new features as well.
So we'll end with the practice question, and we'll want to ask it here. So you plan to create a storage pool on a Windows Server 2016 that will provide storage for an application named App1. You need to ensure that App1 can still function if the server suffers 2 disk failures. How should you prepare the virtual disk for App1?
Now, what's important there is that you need to make sure it can have 2 disk failures instead of just 1 disk failure. So do you want a simple storage layout with 7 physical drives, a mirror layout with 5 disks, a parity layout with 5 disks, or a parity layout with 4 disks? And the answer here is actually going to surprise some people, I think. The answer is B, it's a mirror. So the mirror in Server 2016 with 5 disks, that's a possibility, and you can have 2 failed disks and still retrieve your data.
And the main reason is because there's even though you've mirrored it, there's still one that has the data.
Right. In this case, there's 3 that have it, right?
Exactly.
So in previous operating systems, you would say, oh, I'm going to have to do a stripe set. It's going to have to be a parity layout with at least 5 disks for 2 to fail. But with 5 disks, only 1 can fail and still retrieve that data. So the mirror layout with 5 disks is actually the right answer here.
Excellent. So that really covers much of what we want to talk to you about in terms of implementing storage with Windows Server 2016. Hopefully what we've covered will help you further explore what you need to be prepared for in the exam room. And thanks again for joining us during this module. In this module, we'll be covering installing Windows in host and compute environments. In server, host, and compute environments. It's a very much focused on knowing how to install Windows Server for Windows Server 2016. This first module is really focused on how you would go about installing that platform. Now, there are several ways you can install Windows. You can install it on the host machine. You can install it on a virtual machine. You can even install it on the Nano server.
Nano server is a great new server feature that is even more compact than the core server that we're used to from prior operating systems. We'll talk about Nano server in this module as
So what we want to be able to show you is exactly how we go about solving this. And on the screen, what we see is installing Windows Server. When we go into the portion of the exam that you need to prepare for, there are a number of terms that you need to be familiar with. Installing and upgrading and mitigating servers is really where you want to start. So things like determining the Windows Server 2016 installation requirements, what you need to do to install Windows Server 2016, whether or not you're going to use desired state configuration, and a number of other features that are available when you're installing an upgraded Windows
well. Right,
Server.
including activating it, whether you're using a KMS, Active Directory activation, a MAC key, stuff like that. So we'll take a look at all that in this section.
Now we have a number of different versions of Windows Server 2016, and we've listed them out here so that you're familiar with them. Starting from Windows Server 2016 Essentials and moving on down to the Standard Edition. Now, each one of these versions are there for a specific purpose. For example, the Standard Edition is designed just for the physical server environment with little to no virtualization. Now, if you're looking at Hyper-V, you might have a version of Hyper-V that's only there for hyper-virtualization, and it acts as a standalone for the virtualization platform.
Even with the standard edition, where we put in there little to no virtualization, you can run Hyper-V on a standard edition, but you'd only be licensed up to 2 VMs on standard edition. That's why I would say little to no virtualization. If you had a lot of virtualization, a lot of VMs needed, you probably would want to go with the Hyper-V server.
Now, we also listed out the requirements for installing Windows Server 2016. We start off with the basic requirements, minimum requirements as they call it, and these are things that you need to know for the exam. The minimums, for example, of RAM might be 512 megabytes. This means that if I were going to install Windows Server 2016, Microsoft would only support if you had any issues, it would only support it once they knew that you were installing it based on the minimum requirements. If you called in and said, I am installing it on a 256 megabytes RAM, they would say, well, you need to go ahead and change that. So all these features, from making sure you have 32 gigs of hard drive space, 64 bits of processor architecture, it has to be 64-bit architecture, as well as 1.4 gigs of
Right.
processor speed of
And then there's
CPU.
other things depending on the role of that server, right? You probably want to go to UEFI, the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, as opposed to Legacy BIOS. You don't have to, but there's a lot more security features available when you use UEFI instead of Legacy BIOS. And you probably want a TPM chip if you're going to use any encryption or, again, some more of the security features available to the server that are just more secure with a TPM. They're not part of the minimum requirements because they're not required to install. They're just required for more of the security features once it's installed.
And some of the others that you'll also keep in mind is things like the VGA requirements, 1024 by 768, and making sure you have a keyboard and monitor available so that you can actually do the work. You'll also require internet access most of
Yep,
the time because you need to be able to download any updates and manage those settings once you've set up your Windows Server 2016 system.
exactly.
Now, the installation requirements, when you're installing Windows Server 2016, there are a few things to consider. If you're going to do a clean install, whether you're going to do an upgraded install or a migration install. A clean install means I'm wiping out the system and I'm going to start fresh with a blank system of Windows Server
Right.
2016. The upgrade is really I have an existing version, whether
Yep,
it's
I have
Windows Server.
server, right, I have server 2012 R2, or I have server 2012, and I just want to put in the disk and I want to run it as an upgrade, where all my applications, any user settings, documents, they just remain intact during that upgrade, as opposed to wiping it clean and starting fresh and re-adding everything.
And lastly, the migration, where you're going from one system to another. If you have two different systems that are running Windows Server, one's running Windows Server 2012 or 2016, you can migrate those services over to the next system. Also, be aware of the OS selection. How do you select which OS that you need to run, and whether or not you're going to use the desktop experience or just the core component of Windows Server 2016? By default, how does Windows Server 2016
Yep.
get
You know what?
installed?
Let's go ahead and look at this. You can see on my screen, I have a virtual machine on my screen, and I have the ISO for Server 2016 already mounted here. So I'm going to go ahead and start that. It's going to try to Pixie boot. And once it realizes that I am not Pixie booting, it it launches from the CD. And right away, it says I want to install in English because I actually downloaded the English ISO, English United States. I click Next and Install Now, or if I have a current Windows Server 2016, I can always repair it. We're using this ISO as well, but I do want to install it. Now, at this point, the first thing it's going to ask me for is a key. The key will let it know which version of Windows I am actually installing. So I have a key here for my Data Center Edition. And what you'll notice is if I choose it, that back down for now. It's going to know automatically that I want Data Center Edition. Now, the same thing is if I were to cancel out of this and then use the Standard Edition, it would show that. And if I canceled out of it and then put no key in there at all, just click Next, it would give me what you saw in the screenshot a few minutes ago. It'll give me all 4 of those choices. Now, you can see the choices are Server 2016 Data Center with nothing next to it, and Server 2016 Data Center Desktop Experience. What that means is the default is Core. So Server Core means it has no GUI. It used to be called, in Server 2012 R2, we actually called this Server with GUI. So it has no graphical user interface. It's just the operating system and a big command prompt. And it's just a much smaller footprint, and it can hold most of the roles. What it can't do is it doesn't show a GUI. So most of us will administer a Server Core using either PowerShell or command prompts, or we'll connect to Computer Manager or DNS Manager or DHCP Manager from another console on a GUI machine. I'm going to go ahead and click the desktop experience because that's my preference for right now, and click Next. And I'm not going to go through this whole install because it's, I want to read the license. I'm a speed reader. Next. And custom if I want to do any kind of partitioning of my disk before I go ahead and do this. I can add partitions. I can reformat my partitions. Next. And I'm just going to minimize this while we go on with the module.
Excellent. So I can see here that basically we've looked at the different options for installing Windows Server 2016. The Data Center, the Standard Edition, the Essentials, the Multi-Premium servers, these are all options for installing Server 2016. But don't forget about the storage server. Don't forget about the Hyper-V server. These are also options that are available.
Yeah, it depends on which ISO file that you download. I downloaded one that has Standard and Data Center in it. You can also download the Hyper-V server ISO from your Volume Licensing Service Center or from MSDN for testing.
So again, it's not possible to go between the core and the GUI like you did with Windows Server 2012. So if you're in the exam room and you're looking to get that answer, just remember that you won't be able to move from core to GUI.
That's actually a great point because in 2008 R2, you couldn't go from core to GUI. And then 2012, they said, you know what, we're going to make it easy to go from core to GUI and GUI to core. And then in 2016, they removed that functionality because of some issues that our customers found when they went from core to GUI, GUI to core. It didn't make any sense to keep that functionality with the little issues that they were finding.
So with the configuration of Windows Server 2016, be familiar with partitions, disk size. All of these things are requirements for setting up your Windows Server 2016. Now we'll go a little bit further. We dive into what is NanoServer. And NanoServer itself is what we consider a new headless 64-bit only deployment option for Windows Server 2016. Now, as we compare it to the other platforms, a server with a desktop experience has all the GUIs, it has all the applications that you need available for you to install as part of the image build, and it's there. So the server core cuts down on those options. It makes it a little bit simplified so that you can just install the server core without the management overhead.
And then NanoServer brings that one step further. It's more compact than even Server Core is. It can only hold a few different roles, including Hyper-V, DNS. It can host a subset of the IIS features, but not all of them. It cannot be a domain controller. And you don't actually log into NanoServer. You would actually connect to it and do some remote management when you want to manage it. You can see in the graphic that we have, Server with a desktop experience has this many features and has this much overhead. Server Core is about 60% of that, and then Nano is 1/10 of a desktop experience build.
So most of this was originated in the cloud. We'll see this more and more coming from the cloud from a Nano perspective, and we'll talk about what that means. So Installing and configuring nano server is the next most important piece of this portion of the module. So you need to be able to determine the appropriate usage requirements for the nano server, as well as how to go about installing the nano server. On top of that, you'll need to also understand what managing nano servers
Yep.
are and how you actually do it using Windows PowerShell.
One thing I'd like to bring up here, and I'll bring it up again several times throughout this series, is things are moving really fast here in Redmond and with Microsoft Learning. And Microsoft Learning is doing its best to keep up with all the changes happening in Redmond. So right now, as of today, as we're filming this, Nano Server can actually be installed as the current branch for business model that Windows 10 follows, or as LTSB, long-term servicing branch, like Windows 10 follows. So Nano Server can be either LTSB or CBCBB, current branch for business. The rest of the server operating systems for Server 2016, those are all LTSB only, whether it's Core or GUI, desktop experience. It's standard data center, Hyper-V server, storage server. Those are all only LTSB as of today. Again, things are changing fast. I don't know that that's roadmap, but things are changing fast. So always keep track of the TechNet pages for Server 2016 and the Microsoft Learning page for this specific exam to see when the last time it was updated.
So you talked about just the different options that are available for nano server. That's important that you know what those options are. And are there any other limitations that we should know about nano servers?
Uh, Look, I don't know if it's a limitation, but you can install things like ASP.NET, which is important to install for some applications that you have. Again, some limitations are really the management. Some people will love Nano Server because it's such a small footprint, and some people will not love it because it's not as easy to manage because it has to be done remotely.
Okay. Okay. And so the other piece that we did dive into is just how do you go about getting started with nano server? And we've listed some of those commands here so that you know what you need to do to install the nano server option. Now, you can't just install it from a CD. You actually have
Right.
to extract it and grab those packages and place it in a specific location where you can actually utilize it. And here we listed the nano server folders that have packages of subfolders. Now, each one of those are package files that can be used to install on a nano server itself. We can use something like DISM, Deployment
Yep.
Image and Service Management, a tool to add the package. We give the package path, and that becomes what gets installed on the device itself.
And then you would use PowerShell, add role or feature, and add the DNS package or add the IIS package after Nano Server has been installed. Again, you would do that remotely with a remote PowerShell command, but that's how you would then make it a DNS server or an IIS server or a Hyper-V server.
So again, for this exam, be sure to know what PowerShell is and how you can use it to manage those nano servers as well. The installing roles and features from the package
Oh,
repository.
and there we are. Looks like I was ahead of myself there.
Yeah,
Just
you're
now.
right there. Exactly. Nano servers, like we mentioned, are roles that you can actually install those roles based on the server package. You can find them, you can save them. Again, noun, verb, noun,
Yep.
find, nano server package, save, install. All of these things are things you should be familiar with so that you can differentiate them in the exam questioning process. We also want to think about being able to convert the WIM to a VHD. I've kind of walked you through on a Windows 10 or Windows Server 2016 how to convert a WIM to a VHD. Now, again, this is maybe a little bit more detail than you need for the exam, but knowing that you can actually convert it from one format to another really gives you a heads up
Yeah, and
on.
it allows you to then launch Nano in your Hyper-V environment because it's a VHD file now.
So we listed that command out here. And then the other thing you'll be able to see is the customization. So if I want to, use the customizations to further specialize the nano server, you can actually do that. So things like
Static IP address, join the domain, change the administrator password, all these things. It's almost like an unattended, if you will, an attended answer file. Yep. And we just, again, you just show the different options available in the screen grabs.
So here are a few other options for remotely managing nano server from everything from the remote graphical web tools, PowerShell remoting, VM container management, which we use Hyper-V or Hyper-V Manager, and also other tools like PowerShell Direct. We also look at deployment and monitoring. So DISM can be used to build the images or even VHD support or the desired state configuration is also an
Yep.
option. SCOM. So all of these things are integrated into Nano. So don't think of Nano as a standalone solution. It really is something that's built into Windows Server 2016 and can be managed fairly efficiently with the tools that we have listed here. The last one we had was partners and frameworks. So we have chief integration. We have a number of different solutions that are integrating the management of nano servers as part of the core set of capabilities that can be provided on a
I
nano
think what's
server.
interesting in that part of that list is Python and Ruby and Chef and all these things that you don't really think of to manage your servers. Maybe Linux and things like that, but not your Windows servers. So it's interesting that those have been integrated in as well with Nano Server.
And if we take a look at the server management tools, we'll see here that they're web-based and they include a number of replacements for local-only tools. Now, again, this is a server management tool that managing a server in the cloud or in Microsoft Azure. These tools are things that you can actually utilize because many of the VMs that we run are also configured to run in the cloud. You'll have these options available from the control panel all the way down to the file
Yep.
explorer. Okay, and creating and manage maintaining images for deployment. We have options to deploy using Windows Server Virtualization, Linux FreeBSD, as well as Server Core. So know your options when you're creating those images and deploying them. In the planning for Windows Server Virtualization, here are some things that you need to think
Yeah,
about.
so we've listed some things in the planning. If you were to take, if any of the exam questions are about planning and you are planning your virtualization strategy using Server 2016, what you want to know is which of the servers will be virtualized. Will it be a domain controller? Will it be a web server, DNS server? So which ones will be virtualized? Are you going to be doing all of your servers, only new servers? Uh, Again, what workloads will be on those servers? Again, is it which applications might be on those servers that are being virtualized? And do you need any backup or fault tolerance with these VHDs, with these
Also,
VMs?
determine what the network needs are for the guest
Yep,
VMs because you have the guest VMs, you want to make sure that they have access to the internet if they're required and not just provision them as blank VMs without
exactly.
network access. We also have to plan for virtualization. So, using the MAP toolkit, the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit, you can do things like identify operating systems, hardware, software inventory, Hyper-V,
Yep.
and VMware all through the guest and the host
Yeah,
itself.
and you can push this out to. You can install this on any server, and it's agentless, so it sends a query to a list of servers or to an OU hosting all of your Server 2012 R2 servers, and it will let you know what's running on those, so that you can plan your virtualization strategy as you plan to upgrade them to Server 2016, or go to P2V, the physical server, to a virtual running Server 2016.
Excellent, excellent. And then also planning for Linux and FreeBSD are also options that are available. Again, these are newer features of Windows Server 2016. What's supported, we list here that you can actually emulate uh, emulation and run both Linux and FreeBSD in a Hyper-V
Yep.
platform, as well as it just offers just better performance
Right, and
altogether.
it's nice that you can now put a Linux VM on your server 2016 Hyper-V, where previously you had to use third-party virtualization technologies. Now you can put it on server, and as well as in Azure. But for this exam, you just need to worry about server.
Exactly. And we provided a link in there as well so that you can reference that information. We also talked about updating images based on patches, hot fixes, drivers, and roles. These are all different ways you can update the system at once the image has been pushed out and is being configured for further controls within the organization. We have sector-based image versus file-based image. We have basic strategies for updating images pray- and just when to use online servicing. It may be an
Well,
option.
yep. And again, as I mentioned a little bit ago, right now we're looking at an LTSB version of Server 2016. That's the current model. All server operating systems except for Nano are LTSB only. With Nano, you actually have an opportunity to upgrade that using the current branch for business servicing uh, style or method as like Windows 10 does. We just mentioned that. So keep that in mind as well, that we're looking at security patches and critical patches, not necessarily feature upgrades like you would see with Windows 10 or with Nano.
So let's go ahead and go through a practice question. You plan to install a server that runs Nano Server. You need to ensure that the server can run virtual machines. Which PowerShell command should you run?
So the PowerShell commands that we list for you here are install Nano Server package, Microsoft Nano DCB package, Nano Server host package, guest package, or compute. Which one do you think that is? And if you know PowerShell, if you know Nano Server, as you start practicing into this, you can start eliminating some of these one at a time. It's probably not going to be a guest package, the way that this question is worded, so you can eliminate that one. And so I'd look at each one of these as true, false. Is it A? Nope, that's false. Is it B? Nope, that's false. In this case, the answer is
Ta-da!
It's D. It's a compute server. And we have put the list here as to basically where we got that information from to make sure that we were giving you accurate information on this practice test.
And a few tips before we leave is tip number one, read up on Nano Server. If you haven't seen what Nano Server is, how it can be configured, make sure you understand how it works on the platform. Secondly, tip number two, manage the core. Make sure that you're using the tools that we mentioned, like PowerShell, Domain Join or gjoin, DISM, Windows installation database, or any of those tools. WSUS might be
Yep.
another option. Make sure you're familiar with those terms as it relates to Nano. And thirdly, the server virtualization. Make sure you have an understanding of how you can use the map toolkit to access the needs and the resources that are available for users that are looking to migrate to Windows Server 2016. So hopefully with this first module, we've given you some insight into what's coming with Windows Server 2016, and you've had a chance to sort of build your own lab and start the testing along with us. Again, we want to thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you in the next module.